Hi everyone, and welcome to today's co-production Q&A session, which we're really pleased to be hosting as a way of rounding up our first Get Yourself Active Speedy co-production series. We hope you've been able to watch some of our series that we've been hosting over the past 2 months, which has covered a range of important topics, all to do with co-production. The aim of these sessions has been to support more organisations in both the sports sector and disability sector to understand the basics of co-production, as well as sharing good practice on effectively embedding co-production into practice. Because of the short nature of our webinars, we haven't yet had the opportunity to answer any questions. So we've decided to host this session as a way of answering further questions and perhaps discussing topics we may not have covered in the series. My name is Anna Denham and I work for Disability Rights UK as part of our Get Yourself Active programme, and I'll be hosting this session today. Disability Rights UK is a user-led pan-disability charity that exists to build leadership and power amongst disabled people to create a movement for change. The majority of our staff and trustees have lived experience of disability. We lead on the Get Yourself Active programme, which is funded by Sport England. The aim of Get Yourself Active is to work alongside disabled people to lead change in the social care, health and sports sectors in order to improve health and wellbeing outcomes for disabled people. Co-production is a really important part of the work we do, and we are working closely with other disabled people's user-led organisations and the sports sector to embed co-production in practice, ensuring that the sports sector works effectively with disabled people to co-produce solutions to inactivity. As part of this Q&A session, I'm really pleased to welcome our panellists who are joining today to answer some of your questions. And you may remember them from some of the sessions that have taken place over the past couple of months, as they presented some of our earlier sessions. So we have Kamran Mallick, CEO of Disability Rights UK, who led our session on the social model of disability. And we have Odell, a researcher from Disability Rights UK, who hosted a session on the principles of co-production. We were hoping to be joined by Sue Bott today, but unfortunately Sue's having technical problems, but I'm sure you're in very safe hands with Cameron and Evan, who can answer all of the questions that you've sent in. We've been inviting you to ask questions prior to this session and have collected some of the most popular questions, which I'm going to put to Cameron and Evan today. We'll be finishing within an hour, so we'll get through as many questions as we can in that time. And we'll also be monitoring the chat box, so please do feel free to add any questions or comments in there during the session. So let's make a start and on with our first question. So the first question we've had in today, I think this is one for you, Cameron. How do you get organisational buy-in for true co-production?
Thanks, Anna, and hi everyone. Really pleased to be here, and that's a really interesting and really useful question to kick off with, really, because if we're going to make co-production a reality within our organisations, we've got to understand how we get buy-in within our organisations. And I guess it kind of starts with really kind of the values and behaviours behind our organisation. And for co-production to become, it has to be part of the way that we all choose to work and that the organisation actually works itself. And creating a culture where kind of some of these following values are and behaviours become the norm within our organisations. So ownership and understanding and support for co-production by everybody. So some of people who are listening to us today will have listened to our co-production webinars, and we hope that they've then gone on to read up about co-production and how it works, and then putting it into practice. What are the benefits of co-production and how you actually do it? So really creating an understanding from top down throughout your whole organization about what it is and how you go about doing it. A culture of openness and honesty is really important because, again, we will have heard that co-production is sometimes about really listening to things that maybe we find quite challenging in the way that we currently think. And so really being open to listening to that and being honest about what you hear and kind of what you feed back. A commitment to sharing power and decisions with people. And so throughout our small webinars that we've run, we've talked about co-production is about people, and that it's really about sharing the power that often organizations and professionals, institutions have, and really letting go of some of that and making joint decisions, joint plans, and co-producing in that way. Being really clear in how we communicate and using, I think we say it a lot, using plain English, but actually all of us fall into that trap of talking in jargon, in terminology that means something to us from our industry. But actually the people who often engage with us are not from our world. They're engaging with us to access a service or a provision or something, and are involved with us. And so being really clear in how we communicate with people. And then finally, I guess the other value and behavior is around a culture in which people are valued and respected, so that we get rid of this idea that the people who we should be valuing and respecting are those with, you know, fancy job titles or are in particular parts of the organization, and that everybody has something to bring to the conversation, to co-production, that people are experts in their experience, and bringing that and bringing it into our organizations is really valuable. So I think it's a whole organizational approach is where I would say. It absolutely has to start at the top, and real ownership by whatever your structures are within your business. The governance people, members of staff, everybody takes ownership of it. So that kind of would be where I would start.
Great, thank you, Kamran. And you made a really good point there about professionals having to really share power and move away from thinking that they're the experts. I don't know if you or Evan, either of you, would have any sort of tips on how people that are traditionally kind of in that you know, sphere of feeling that they're the ones in power, how they can actually begin to relinquish some of that power. How do they sort of move away from that and actually start to share the power and see people as equals? Do you have any experiences of that or any tips, either of you?
I mean, I would start by saying I think it's for people who are on a career path and a profession, you know, have this label of we're in a profession, often find it hard to let go of power because they feel they've got the experience, they've got the knowledge, they know how to do everything right. But actually, and that's okay, they have a certain level of experience, they have a knowledge, whether it might be an academic knowledge or it might be kind of through your job and career that you've done. So you are an expert in many ways, but what you're not, and none of us are experts in, is what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. So, you know, I know what it's like as an Asian disabled person, but I don't know what it's like if I was, you know, for a woman disabled person with a different impairment. So part of letting go of that power is to say, I know about me and I can bring my professional knowledge, but what I don't know is what it's like for you. And I want to hear from you so I can listen, understand, and absorb that knowledge and develop a solution with you. So although it's about letting go of power, and that can often be scary, or actually what happens is you grow as a person yourself. And ultimately you just get a better end service or program, whatever it is that you are ultimately trying to. So that's kind of what I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to add to that, and this also sort of fits with the first question as well, is there's a real value in sort of starting small. One of the issues around co-production sometimes is you'll see quite a few people will try to sort of, they'll have like a vision of what like an ideal co-produced organization looks like or co-produced program looks like, and they try to implement that and it falls apart because there's not sufficient buy-in from people who are having to totally rework how they have done their job, and it could be a job they've been doing for decades in a very short period of time. Whereas starting smaller, starting with like, you know, bits of aspects of co-production or sort of in certain areas allows you to accomplish a lot more and kind of ease people into this way of working rather than it being a quite like drastic transformation, which is also just very, very risky because, you know, it might not actually work. And then you've spent a lot of time and energy and run a lot of risks to end up in like the same position you were before or potentially even worse. So starting off small and sort of easing people into the practices of co-production just makes it far more sustainable than trying to implement your ideal world from day one.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say, I think if you do it, I like that. I think starting off small, I think it's always harder, irrespective of what size of organization you are, to do something that maybe you've never done before. It's a new concept to you. You've got to get lots of buy-in. You've got to get people coming with you. So doing it in small chunks is a really good idea, and testing and learning that idea of you do it and you see how it works, you get feedback and you slowly refine it yourself. Because not everything that you might pick off the shelf or you might read in a textbook or from these webinars might not just directly work as the way we might talk about it, but as long as you understand the concept and you have a clear vision of where you're trying to get to. And it's kind of a win-win all round, isn't it? You get a better service, you get more people accessing your service, more loyal to you because they know that they're being listened to. So in all aspects, it's just kind of a win-win all round, really.
I think that's so true, isn't it? It's exactly what you both just said. It's start off small, don't make it bigger or more complex than it needs to be. And it's just about realizing that other people can also be the experts. I think we all go into something with our own thoughts, judgments, own experiences, but of course we all have different experiences to contribute, and it's stepping back, isn't it, and just sort of saying, as you said, Cameron, you know, I'm one gender, I'm either disabled or non-disabled, I can only bring my experiences, but other people bring theirs, and we have to just step back and let them contribute and see them as equals, don't we? That's exactly it. And it's a win-win situation, like you say. If you're designing something for people to access, a service for them to use, if you don't bring them in and they're the experts, they're the service users at the end of the day, it's not going to be fit for purpose. So it really is a win-win, like you say, definitely. Let's move on to our next question, which when I looked at earlier, I thought, oh, this one looks like Evan, I'm sure, will have lots to contribute to, and of course you too, Cameron. And so the question is, how could you evidence outcomes in order to drive co-production forward and demonstrate it is the right way to do things?
Well, you'd want to be looking at the kinds of outcomes that I assume you would be trying to achieve anyways. And you know, depending on what the goal of a project is or what an organization is, co-production is there to help you meet those goals. So that should be sort of what you're focusing on. You'd want to see, so if you're interested in, say, like the well-being or the amount of physical activity that your service users are reporting or engaging in, if that's your primary measure, that's what you should be measuring. And if you're using co-production as your strategy or even part of a strategy to help encourage that, it's important to note that down. And you can see, like, you know, what changed after we started doing co-production. And you know, that can take it can sometimes take a long time to kind of translate through from the process of co-production into like a measurable, sustainable change in people's lives and ways of working. But that's usually what should be focused on in terms of evidencing outcomes. And as well, for everyone engaged in co-production, it's always good to get feedback on what they thought of the process, how it impacted them, how they think it's changed, what, you know, they liked or disliked, what more could be done to improve it and to make it as successful as possible. But you know, co-production is not fundamentally changing the overall aims of your work most of the time. And so those are, you know, the stuff that you've been measuring in the past are still the things you want to be measuring now.
Yeah, and that really kind of Evan said exactly what is the right response really to that question. It's not about fundamentally changing what you want to achieve, because that's the thing you want to get to. And if it's better health outcomes, for example, co-production just means it's a framework that you fit around that helps you deliver that really successfully. And the point Evan said about feeding back, co-production, if you look at the model as a diagram, there's this continuous loop that people tell you, and you work with people into how you structure something, how you deliver something. Then it's really important that they are part of that feedback system, that they are part of that journey. And I think what people will find and organizations will find is if they do it well and they implement the co-production values and models, is people will naturally want to tell you when it's working really well. And remembering I said about having an open culture where you listen, so you will listen to people saying this doesn't work for me, here's why, how do we fine tune it, it now works for me. So you'll just have this continuous process. Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds as though it's kind of
two things in a way you need to kind of track and evidence. And one is that people have enjoyed the co-production process itself. So that in itself, I think, is something you can actually capture and use to sort of demonstrate that co-production is enjoyable and it works for people. But then also, like you say, evidence the outcomes at the end of it. So is this the service that people wanted? Have they ended up with a product or whatever it might be that you were initially setting out to produce for them or to design for them? So it's kind of following it through, isn't it? And the theory is, I guess, if you've co-produced something, the end result is actually what it is you all intended to produce from the very beginning, because you've involved people, you've co-produced with them, and what you've come up with at the end should actually sort of be fit for purpose and be exactly what everyone had in mind, shouldn't it?
And hopefully even
actually, yes.
hopefully even better than what you hoped, you know, what you envisaged, because you've listened to what people, how they want the service to be delivered. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes, definitely. And it's just making sure you capture that and evidence it, isn't it, really? So don't lose that learning, and share it as well. What I always say, when you have good examples, capture it and share it with people as well. Brilliant. So on to our next question. How would you adapt your approach to co-production when working with children? Can you give any examples of projects? I'd open this up to either of you.
I mean, it's sort of like adapting anything for children. And the biggest thing is just to make sure that they're able to engage with it. And so that might be using materials that are more aimed at kids. It might just be around timing. And of course, depends a lot on the age of children. Co-production with 16, 17-year-olds is a very different process than co-production with 8 and 9-year-olds. Like what you're actually going to be doing is just totally different, but the same principles apply. It's about recognizing people's expertise about their own lives and their own priorities, and developing ways of getting them to fit into those priorities. In terms of particular projects, there was still kind of ongoing group based at the University of Coventry under the name of RIP Stars, which was funded through the Disability Research and Independent Living and Learning funding program a few years ago. That is a kind of group of academics and young people from about 16 to 23, 24, looking at education, health, and care plans, and engaging in very co-produced research. And it is we'll try to circulate a link to some of their work afterwards, but it's very much a prime example of co-production involving children and young people that is really quite powerful and effective, and also very it's a very positive experience for the young people themselves. It gave them a sense of control over their lives in a way that is kind of hard to replicate any other way.
Yeah, and I guess the other bit I'm sure people listening will be thinking about is, when you're working with children and young people, is some of the kind of legislative frameworks around that. So the whole concept of safeguarding, we talk about vulnerable people and those kind of bits that we have to do as organization. I think co-production doesn't impact on that at all. So those things you still do, and absolutely you do, but co-production fits within all of that. So you can maintain all the right things around safeguarding and protecting young people, but at the same time, actually co-production almost helps to facilitate that, because what you're saying is what is it that young people want to do, and how do they want to do it, and how can we help facilitate in making that happen. So actually, I think those two things complement. So the approach might be tailored for, because it's younger people or different age groups, but the concepts and framework around co-production remains the same.
Absolutely, yes. And I would also add, that people shouldn't be afraid to maybe seek the support of an independent person or organisation to tailor something to a particular age group. So just to give an example, a few years ago, I worked on a research project on co-production with the University of Bristol. And there was a local authority who was commissioning various services for young disabled people. And what they did was they worked with some sort of key college groups, and the young people were aged sort of 16 to 20. But they had a youth worker who would run the sessions. And I have no doubt at all that without that youth worker, those sessions might not have worked. He adapted all the kind of legal talk that was in all the sort of invitation to tender documents and things, to something that was attainable and accessible to young people. He made the sessions fun. He was great at sort of drawing out their thoughts and their opinions on things, and really sort of pivotal to that kind of the two-way conversation between the local authority and the young people. So I think sometimes you might need that expertise when you're working with a young age group. Yeah,
absolutely agree. And I guess it's like any area like that. So if you're working for the first time with disabled people and you're trying to do co-production with a group of disabled people, you might want to bring in an expert on that. So yeah, absolutely. Whether it's young people or disabled people, whatever. Yeah, there's a whole range of people out there, consultants, organisations like Disability Rights UK and others, who can bring in some of that other expertise to complement. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were just saying earlier, weren't we, Cameron, that we did just that on the Enable Fund project we worked on last year, when we were looking at reasonable adjustments for disabled people campaigning for local election, and we had a panel, like an advisory group as well, who were disabled people, basically, you know, helping us to co-produce that service that we were delivering, because they have the lived experience, they're the experts.
And it was really interesting, wasn't it? Doing that, they would often pick out things that actually you and I just didn't think of, because we've not experienced the world from that perspective. So if you're deaf or if you have some other impairment, you can kind of think what it might be, but until you hear it from an individual who says, that's how it impacts on me, it's really just kind of, it made the end delivery of that service so much better, and people were more receptive to it as a result of what you did with that particular project.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely did. Just like we said, more heads around the table, more lived experience, more diversity. You know, you can't go wrong, can you? Not at all. So this brings us actually nicely onto the next question we've had, which I'm sure either of you can answer this, but I think Evan in particular might have lots of ideas. And that is, what tools are available to help create a variety of accessible formats for any surveys, etc., that you might need in your co-production process?
So I'm not aware of any kind of particular tools that are very widely used to create surveys. A lot of accessible material is still made rather ad hoc. I mean, in terms of accessibility, the two that I'm most aware of are making surveys accessible to people who are visually impaired or who are blind, and then for people with learning disabilities, so creating easy read surveys, and then also sort of electronic surveys that are screen reader compatible. So most electronic, like online survey companies do offer guides to how to make their surveys as accessible as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of the time that's not the default setting. So for example, something like SurveyMonkey, there's only limited themes that are fully compatible with screen readers, and there's certain question types that are not compatible with screen readers. And as well, for like, you can make easy read online surveys, but those usually cost more to make, because easy read requires embedding images and usually like pictures and graphics to help people understand what the question is about. And there's a whole kind of like language to easy read as well, based not just on text, but on like the visual images. And so it can be quite difficult to create yourself from scratch unless you've got quite a lot of experience with easy read documents. And there's a variety of services out there that can help make easy read surveys. And there's a few examples that you can find relatively easily online that are quite good, from organizations like the Care Quality Commission. And yeah, but
I was just going to come up with a follow-up question, if that's all right, Anna. So it was just, Evan, you said about SurveyMonkey that some of the templates or certain question kind of response systems don't work. Do they actually tell you the ones that don't work, or is it a case of trial and error? Or
so they do tell you. There is like a accessibility page, and it lists the themes that work, and it tells you the kinds of questions to avoid. One of the issues is that multilingual surveys are not compatible with screen readers. So if you have a population that you want to survey where you want to provide multiple language options, unfortunately, that means you're probably going to have to create different surveys for different languages if you want to also have them be as accessible as possible to various, to screen readers and to other kinds of electronic accessibility equipment. It's a lot of the stuff is still rather primitive, unfortunately. And as well, that there's a the other thing as well, for getting as much feedback as possible, it's good to have things in multiple formats. So although sort of data entry from paper is a pain, it can help you get at people who are otherwise not going to respond to an electronic survey for any number of reasons. So it's worth trying to, if you have the time and the resources, to have as many ways for people to submit feedback as possible.
And the other thing you said was about, and it chimes with keeping your language as simple as possible to start with. So you talked about easy read versions, which are absolutely a must, I think, when you're doing this, but actually it works even better is if you just start from the premise that if you're doing co-produced work, that you keep the idea of plain English, remove all the jargon. And I think we all say that, don't we? But we all naturally fall into that trap of using acronyms and words that are in our world, but to the average person outside, it might mean nothing, or it might mean something completely different.
Yeah, and I think it's also remembering at the very outset is to say to everyone who's participating in the co-production with you, you know, what can I do to make the sessions or this piece of work or this project enjoyable and comfortable for you and accessible to you, and quite often people can tell you, you know, what adjustment they might need, and it might not be that, you know, it could be quite straightforward a lot of the time. It's just saying, can I have something in a particular font size, please? Or please don't send it as a PDF because I can't enlarge it, or my screen reader doesn't work with that, whatever it might be. So it's just making sure you ask as well, isn't it? And doing everything you can. There's always a way around things to make them accessible to people, isn't there? So,
and if you're following the principles of co-production as you're developing it, you'd be involving people anyway. So yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Because if you're sort of, I don't know, thinking, oh, we're going to design a presentation together or something, and several people or even one person in the group is actually the presentation itself, that whole concept is not accessible to me, it doesn't work for me, then you have to say, right, okay, let's scrap that, and what works for everyone then, let's look at a different approach. Is it making a video? Whatever it might be, but it's like you say, it's designing it from the very beginning together, isn't it, Cameron? Really, yeah.
And surveys and kind of feedback methods are a great way to start engaging in co-production, because that can be, you know, the aim of any kind of survey you're doing of your users or of your customers is to improve that service. And having co-production and the creation of that survey will help you end up with a survey that actually targets the kinds of stuff that the people that you are engaging with care about the most. And it's, you know, if you're looking for a way to start doing co-production within your organization, surveys and user feedback is a really easy way to introduce it, because it's a relatively straightforward and usually kind of contained piece of work, and it's very easy to demonstrate how co-production made the end result much more effective than it otherwise could have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next question, which isn't so far away from accessibility, because it's talking about adjusting things for all of us. Do you have any inspiration or suggestions for taking part in co-production during the pandemic? So maybe someone's thinking about online things there, but it could mean anything really.
Sorry, was the question, do we have examples of?
So was there any inspiration or suggestions for taking part in co-production during the pandemic? So I guess we need to do things a bit differently now. So we can't have face-to-face meetings. Maybe people are thinking, what's the point? How can we actually get together in a room and know each other? And, you know, perhaps people are getting that motivation even to co-produce at the moment.
I'll kick off just by, so I spoke to someone a couple of weeks ago who's been running tennis sessions for disabled people on Zoom. Now, immediately I thought, how does that even work? And how did he even come up with that? And he was a tennis coach prior to the lockdown. He still is a tennis coach, but was thinking, well, how do I do that? So all the community of people that he was in touch with, he kind of talked to them really and said, this is what we were doing before. What are your ideas about what we could do online? And would you like to have a go? And he went through a process of just trying different methods with that group of people, that idea of testing and learning, getting feedback. It was ultimately going to be a group of people who would then use that kind of online sessions. And he then he developed it with a group of tennis players. It got picked up by other communities, and then a group of blind people contacted him and said, you know, we'd love to, what can we do? It's about keeping active really at home. And he's gone on and developed that session for people who are blind now, using some of the techniques that he'd learned with the other group with tennis, adapting it with feedback from people. That was really innovative in taking something that you really thought, this can't be done, can it? In a digital format in this way. But it's worked, and it's worked because he was open to trying it, getting involved with the very people who would hopefully use it, listening to what they were saying, and kind of that idea of co-producing the end delivery method really. And he's now running regular sessions for people online on Zoom. So that was a really interesting example of using some elements of co-production and delivering something quite unique. It was kind of one that comes to mind immediately.
There's also like the effect of people being stuck at home a lot potentially means they have time to engage in things they otherwise previously would not be able to engage in. So I think nothing's really going to ever replace the usefulness of face-to-face meetings for some things. And even with the best will in the world, programs like Zoom are not going to be accessible for some people a lot of the time. You can also use the opportunity to engage people who you previously would have struggled to get to engage in co-production in person for any number of reasons. And that could be from like, you know, working schedules or caring responsibilities, or people who have like disabilities or long-term health conditions where they are rarely able to get out of their house or have a very sort of limited amount of time and energy in a given day or a given week. And so it is definitely worth trying. And with a lot of stuff with co-production, the approach is just try stuff and see if it works. And don't be afraid of engaging in a bit of experimentation and a bit of trial and error, and sort of see how it goes.
Yeah, I've heard this pandemic phase being described by a lot of disabled people as kind of like the big experiment, because actually a lot of things that we as disabled people have been asking for, flexible working, for example, remote access to meetings, to events, to seminars, to webinars, suddenly we're all having to do it, and it's working. And suddenly I think whatever happens from today onwards with the pandemic and how societies arrange ourselves, I'd like to think that we'll take some of the lessons learned and some of the models that we've now brought in to engage with a wider range of people, to bring in that different experience, the lived experience, for people who couldn't get to meetings or face-to-face co-produced sessions, who can engage remotely. It's really powerful, I think.
Absolutely. First of all, I love that story about the tennis coach, Cameron. I really do. I think that's just great. But you're both absolutely right that in some ways online has opened things up for a lot of people, because it's taken away that barrier of travel, maybe time constraints, also perhaps having support as well. Maybe somebody might just need a little bit of support to access something, but doesn't want to take a person with them maybe to a meeting in a council office or a leisure centre, wherever it might be, but just being able to perhaps log on at home and that person's there in the background should they need them, can open it up and make it more accessible. I've spoken to a couple of people who are on the autistic spectrum who have said they actually prefer things being online. It takes away the anxiety of travelling to an unknown place, meeting people they haven't met and don't necessarily like shaking hands with people and all these things. And so just being able to, you know, being in the comfort and the safety of your own home and just being able to log on and, you know, feel little bit more in control and less anxious, that it isn't necessarily a bad thing. So I think, yes, of course, we want to have some face-to-face and go back to that in many situations, absolutely. But like you say, please let's not lose some of this, because it's definitely opened things up for a lot of people, hasn't it? It really has. Yeah. Great, we're doing really well. I really like this next question. Interesting to see what you both think of this one. Who should instigate co-production?
I mean, I think whoever really wants to make it happen should instigate it. Usually these things have more purchase if they're able to get buy-in from, you know, whoever has a lot of authority and sway and influence in an organization, and particularly someone who can help set budgets and ensure that co-production is properly resourced and supported. But I think it can be instigated by anyone who thinks that it would be beneficial to a particular thing. And I think that, you know, given the nature of like service provision organizations, it usually has to come from within, but you know, the idea can come from service users and from other people. So there's not like a particular person who has to. I think it's whoever thinks it would be beneficial.
Yeah, so I think if I'm thinking about the disability movement and our organizations and disabled people, a lot of the co-production ideas have come from us as disabled people, in the way that we wanted certain elements of our lives that were really important. So things around social care, health and social care, that's where disabled people were saying that we want to not be stop being done to, and we want to be in control of how we want that support arranged, delivered, and all those kind of areas. So that's where it's come from in terms of the disability movement, and our organizations are very much co-produced organizations because they're the values that we've always held. But I think otherwise, outside of that, as Evan says, it can kind of come from anywhere. If it's coming from your service users or people who come into your business organization, as long as hopefully if you're an open listening organization, when people say that to you, that you will then want to kind of go with it, and as we've said, test and learn, try it out, have a go. But outside of that, often it comes from within. It's got to be buying in from the senior top kind of people who've got the positions of influence, who can make the decisions, who can allocate funding, who can put it into strategy, who can make sure that co-production is part of your delivery strategy, how you do things, who can influence cultures. So I think it can be a really mixed range of people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was listening to you both there. Do you think organisations that don't have a partnership board, for example, should be looking to set one up so that when they want to go produce a service or a facility or something, they've got a kind of ready-made group of people they can at least start off with? It might not be the right people maybe, but they can build from that, rather than, right, we want to co-produce this new service, this new leisure facility, where do we start? Is it an idea maybe to get those kind of processes and those sort of systems in place already?
I would be wary of doing that unless there's a plan to immediately engage in it. So one of the potentially like big kind of risks of co-production, if it's done particularly badly, is if people involved feel that it hasn't actually given them any more influence over the stuff that they care about. And they might spend a lot of time and spend a lot of energy and maybe spend some of their own money on it, and nothing has changed. That is usually quite depressing and almost distressing. It has like a negative impact on people's sort of sense of self and stuff, according to some research on the topic. And I think that you also need to have a plan. And so as well, like sort of setting up a board like that's one way of doing co-production, but it's not the only way of doing co-production. Depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve and the kind of organization you are, you may need to go with other models that are much more ad hoc or much more interchangeable. But I think regardless, you need to make sure that there's stuff for people to do that is meaningful and genuine co-production, rather than them signing up to maybe be doing something in 2 years' time.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add to that. That was a completely good response from Evan. I'd agree with what he's just said.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you said that, Evan, because now sort of thinking back, I have spoken to a couple of people in the past who have said they're on a partnership board, whatever it might be called, and they just feel like it's meetings for the sake of meetings. So there'll be these quarterly meetings, and it sometimes feels a bit tick box maybe, and that might be because there isn't actually anything to be working on at the moment. So yeah, it's great to keep in contact, to have that dialogue, but you need to be focusing on a project, don't you, on co-creating something together. So I guess then a question from me might be, how do people, when they decide they do want to co-produce something, how do they go about finding those people if they don't have a ready-made board or network or whatever it might be?
So I guess the first port call obviously is your existing group of service people who use your service and whatever it is you're doing. So there will be lots of people that you're engaging with anyway. And so looking within that group of people would be the obvious first thing. And then after that, I'd say look to your local organizations, wherever you might be, to find the organizations that work with people. So whether it's disabled people or a women's group or whatever it might be that you're looking for, reach out through their networks, and they will have access and contacts with lots of local people. There are organizations like ours that are national, that again have lots of reach throughout the country. So again, using those networks really. So start with your own group of community that you've built up, and then also bring in some of the other networks and organizations around.
I think it is important to try to get those outside voices as well, because in terms of making a business case for co-production, if it's a means of bringing in people to your service or to your business or whatever it is that you're doing who otherwise wouldn't have come or would not have even thought of coming, that can be a quite useful way of selling the project to someone who's worried about spending money on it, or about customer acquisition or things like that. So the people who are not using your service are as important as the people who are using your service, because they might become potential service users or might become potential customers that you otherwise wouldn't be able to benefit from.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good point, Evan. Yeah, thank you. Really good question next, and we've slightly touched on this. It's a two-part question. Is co-production always the right thing to do? What would happen if co-production is badly done?
So it is, of course, it's not like a magic bullet or a panacea or what have you. It is, there's not I don't want to say there's certain circumstances where you should always use co-production, certain circumstances where you never should. It's very much a question of judgment. But co-production can, if say you're trying to solve a particular issue and the problem is well known, the solutions are quite obvious, people will sometimes engage in co-production as a means of avoiding having to deal with the problem that they're supposedly trying to get rid of. And rather than simply doing it, they'll create a whole process where they just have more people tell them to do this thing that they should have potentially done ages ago, rather than simply doing it. And as like I mentioned before, if it is badly done, people feel very disempowered, and you can alienate your service users or your customer base because they just feel like they're not actually being listened to. Because you can feel like you're not being listened to if you don't really get any chances to say anything. But if you get chances to say stuff, and you are in a position where you're told that you're holding other people accountable, that they have to respond to you, and then they don't, or nothing changes, nothing happens because of what you've done, that can be quite it's just not a very good outcome. And also just in those cases, if it can raise the question of why engage in co-production if you're not actually going to respond or even sort of fully acknowledge what it is that you're being told or what it is that you're hearing through the co-production process.
Yeah, so I think people, when they embark on co-production, have to really mean it, don't they? Because I think everyone's been in a situation where they've been invited to give their opinion on something, and come away from that meeting or whatever and thought, I don't know why I was sitting there, because I felt no one was listening to me, or no one made a note suggested, and it's, there was no point in me being there. And I think that can be really detrimental in the long term, can't it? Because if people have that experience, it will put them off in future. They'll just think, well, what's the point? I've tried that and no one listened to me. So that's the last thing we want to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we've said, haven't we, in that co-production is a process, and that to make it meaningful, there are certain things that you must do. I think the other thing is, so the question was around, should you use it all the time, or are there situations where you might not? I think, as Evan said, it's not always appropriate for everything, but often if you're not getting the results that you expected, or that you're completely missing a demographic of population, and you just don't know why, they are great times when you really should use co-production, because if a whole community is not using your service, or a whole demographic is not accessing a service that you think is targeted at them, you have to ask yourself why, and the people to ask is the people who are not accessing it. And so Evan's earlier point about reaching out to people who don't use your service and asking them, well, why don't you use it? What are the barriers? What are the blocks? What are the reasons you're not engaging with us? That's when co-production is a great kind of framework to bring in, to understand that. So yeah, there'll be times when you do, and there'll be times when it might not be appropriate in that sense. But I think the values that I talked about earlier at the beginning, I think every good organization, business, if it held on to those values, is always a good thing.
I think in terms of when it's worth really thinking about co-production, in particular at times when you're engaging in big changes. So, you know, if you're having a big reform to how you work, or you're moving locations or anything like that, although that is, like, you know, quite often a stressful time for a lot of organizations, it's also a time where it's much easier to change stuff than it would be normally, because, you know, everything's going to be different, or a lot of things are going to be different. And it allows you to sort of, you know, you're moving to a new space, and it just lets you operate out of that space in a new way. And it's much easier to sort of change people's ways of working somewhere different rather than to completely change what it is that they're already doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can see we have about 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes left. And we're coming up to our last question and a kind of roundup. So before I move on to that, I would just reiterate, if anyone's got any questions while they're sitting here listening, please do put them in the chat box, and hopefully we can get through one or two of those as well. So our next question, and this could be our final one unless we receive some in the chat box, it's a kind of comment question. I'm finding working in co-production very frustrating, because everyone in the group has a different opinion and nobody seems willing to compromise. How do I get around this problem?
Have you got examples of that, Evan, when you've done some of the work?
I don't have any kind of concrete examples of that, but I think the thing to do in those kinds of situations is to kind of go back to first principles and think about what is it we're trying to accomplish with co-production, and what is the shared goal. And ideally, when engaging in co-production, everyone has the same ultimate goal that they want to have, which is usually around, you know, it can be any number of things, but that sort of anything from, like, you know, professionals and people of expertise through that, as well as like service users and members of the public, should all have the kind of a shared goal. So it's about making sure that everyone is on board with that goal. And, you know, you can have a lot of disputes about then how you get there. And you might even have a lot of disagreements about where you are currently. But I think that the thing to do is to try to you can resolve those conflicts and resolve those difficulties by trying to bring everyone back in the first place to what it is that you're actually trying to do. And from there, hopefully you will be able to, you know, link people together and bring people on board with the with what your aims are, and hopefully that's a means of smoothing over stuff. And of course, there's always going to be disagreements, and you're not going to have any kind of, like, you know, it's hard to get complete consensus, particularly on very contentious things. But reminding people of the goal is always a means of kind of achieving cohesiveness.
Yeah, the first kind of the shared vision, shared goals are the things that you would go back to, and just accept the fact that when you have a diverse group of people, it's often very hard to kind of what every individual wants, but as long as you agree on where you're trying to get to, how you generally want it to be, and you achieve most of that, that's the goal. Rather than saying everyone must agree on every single point, because it's almost impossible to get that. Everyone, we're so diverse in terms of our likes, dislikes, wants, needs, that actually that total agreement is almost impossible.
Yeah, I think, I'm sure it was one of the earlier webinar sessions we had where we spoke about at the very beginning, have like almost a memo of understanding drawn up or something at the beginning, that this is what we're trying to co-produce, this is how we're going to go about it. Everyone has to be on board at the very beginning and agree to that, don't they? Otherwise, later on, you'll hit those stumbling blocks that, and people just won't agree. So it's being clear from the very outset, isn't it? And listening and accepting, and you have to just compromise that everyone's happy with what it is you're trying to produce. We have a couple of questions I can see in the chat, which is great. They're fairly similar, so I'll read them both and you might want to kind of answer them together. The first is, do you have any examples or approaches for how to successfully involve people with more complex disabilities in co-production? And the second one is, how do you cope with different levels of ability to grasp details in a co-production group? I find when delivering training, there's a time limit and it can be difficult for some people to catch up. So I think the thing there is about how do you make sure, perhaps if time is a constraint, that, or if people have perhaps more complex needs, that everyone is able to understand, participate, and be equal and co-produce.
I'll come in on that first point around examples, approaches of how to successfully involve people with more complex impairments in co-production. So in a previous role that I was in, we ran a very large youth service with young people with a very wide range of impairments. Some young people have very complex impairments as well, and multiple impairments. And so we had a very diverse range of young people with a very wide range of abilities to learn and understand and comprehend and engage and communicate. And so we adopted lots of different methods. So we would have certain individuals, young people would have support workers who were supporting them one-to-one and would do some work with them. We would use different communication things like communication boards that were designed so that they could engage. And sometimes it does require more time. And I mean, if time is the barrier that's preventing someone, then that's the bit that you need to change, rather than saying to someone, well, you can't engage because we haven't got the time. It's finding what are the barriers that that person's experiencing, and how do we best remove them. And I accept that, there isn't always unlimited time and there aren't unlimited budgets, but I think there are often really great techniques that are out there, such as, as I described, picture boards, one-to-one support, key workers. There's all sorts of methods that exist and work really well, that can be brought in to help make sure. And it's really important when you're doing co-production that you leave no one behind, that everyone feels that they can input, that they understand, and that what they're saying is being taken seriously. Because actually, the individual with the complex impairment, the multiple impairments and the multiple barriers is the person whose voice you really need to be listening to, because if you can start to deliver your service in a way that removes the barriers for them, it's going to benefit so many other people. So there are some really good examples, and what I can do is I can put a link to that organization in the chat, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to people if they've got over 20 years of experience of delivering a really vibrant youth service in all the school holidays and summer holidays as well, and age groups from 13 all the way to 25, so quite a diverse age group as well.
I think as well on that point, it's another case of trying to be, being flexible, being creative. And as well, we usually think of like co-production as being, you have like a group of people that are all meeting together at the same time. And although that usually is how it works, you don't necessarily have to do that. It is possible to allow people to engage in co-production sort of on a one-to-one basis, or to have input and influence over your ways of working, or over your policies or your practices or your organization, even if they're not able to be like in a room with a bunch of other people doing the same thing at the same time. And so it's around like working with individuals as well to see what it is that, you know, they want to be doing. Do they, you know, want more time in meetings? Do they want to have like a private catch-up session afterwards to help them process stuff? Do they just want to have materials in advance and have just more time to prepare and think about stuff? So there's not like a single thing that you can do, but it's you know, you can co-produce how you co-produce, and it usually works out.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier on, asking people, what do you need to make this process, this session accessible to you, comfortable, enjoyable? And, you know, if you do only have a 1 hour block for a meeting, it could be something as simple as sending some documents or whatever it might be through in advance to that person, so they can read through them before and take their time, and perhaps someone at home can help them to make sense of them, or having that catch up one-to-one meeting or phone call afterwards. So it's asking, people know what works best for them, don't they? And it's just asking people, does this work for you? How can I make this enjoyable and accessible to you? So we're coming to the end. I think we've only got a few minutes left. And whenever I go on these online things, I always like to take at least one little nugget of information that I won't forget. And actually, Kamran, I think you've given me mine already. You said leave no one behind. I think that is, if I'm going to take one thing from this session, it's that. You know, for me, that's what co-production is. Before I sort of round up, do either of you want to add anything like that? Is there any sort of takeaway point, one point you'd like people just to, if they forget everything else, please don't forget this one point, the sort of top tip?
Don't be afraid. Like, you know, there's people, you know, the co-production can go badly and everything else can go badly. You know, that's the, I'm actually not sure if I should use this phrase given this is a professional meeting, but there are, you know, famous sayings about how stuff happens, and, you know, just try it and see if it works, and be open and be flexible, and don't be afraid of failure, and don't be too hung up on, you know, all this other kind of like, you know, just being overly protective is yeah, let people engage, let people input, let people have influence, and see what happens.
Yeah, and Anna, as you stole mine, I'm going to steal Evans. No, it's fine. So his point about start small, you know, kind of just get going, particularly if you're from a big organization where you've got multiple departments and teams and hundreds of people. It can probably seem quite overwhelming to think, well, how do we apply this across the whole organization? So kind of the idea of start somewhere, start within a project, co-produce a project, learn, share those findings with what you learned. How was that journey? What went wrong? What went really well? What are some of the pitfalls, things to really avoid and things to really make sure you do, and share that with your wider organization. Then start implementing it across the organization. Build it into your strategy, into your work plans, into team plans, all of that stuff. And yeah, so start small and then spread it.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you both. So that's what I'm going to take away. Don't be afraid, start small and leave no one behind. Well, I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I hope people that have joined us have enjoyed it and learned a lot. And of course, they can email us at any time. Liddy's email address is on our website. It's attached to the invitation you will have received. Thank you for the comments, the questions we've received. We've really found those helpful, and it's good to get us all thinking. Thank you, of course, to Kamran and to Evan. You've both been fantastic. Just to let you know, we are still planning some more webinar sessions on co-production, and we've got one ready, or booked, I should say, for the 12th of August at 11 o'clock, when we're going to have International Mixed Ability Sports, or IMAS as they're known for short, who will be presenting co-production and practice for us. So please do book on for that and email Liddy. Her email's in the chat box, and she's also put those links up to the organisations and the reports and things that both Kamran and Evan have mentioned. So I think that's it. I think we're coming up to the hour. Thank you again. I hope you've all enjoyed it and you've learned something, and keep in touch with us all. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.